You're standing in a crowded square. The smell of bread from a nearby stall mixes with sweat and dust. Somewhere behind you, a man is about to lose his hand. Not for murder, not for treason, but for stealing a loaf of bread. And the strange part? The crowd around you isn't horrified. Some of them are cheering. A few are taking bets on how he'll react. If you think modern justice is harsh, you have no idea what came before it. Because the story of how ancient humans punished criminals is stranger, bloodier, and in some ways more logical than anything we do today. So how do we go from mob justice to courtrooms? The answer goes a lot deeper than an eye for an eye. Let's start nearly 4,000 years ago in the city of Babylon under a king named Hammurabi. Around 1754 BCE, Hammurabi did something almost nobody had done before at that scale. He wrote the punishments down, 282 laws carved into a 7-foot slab of black basalt standing in public for anyone to see. And yes, the famous line really is in there. An eye for an eye, a tooth for a tooth. But here's where it gets strange. The punishment depended entirely on your social class. If a nobleman knocked out the eye of another nobleman, he lost his own eye. But if that same nobleman blinded a commoner, he simply paid a fine. Justice wasn't equal. It was proportional to who you were born as. And that single idea that punishment should scale with status would quietly shape legal systems for the next 3,000 years. Now here's the part nobody talks about. Some of the harshest ancient punishments weren't actually about revenge at all. They were theater. Take ancient Athens around the 7th century BCE under a lawmaker named Draco. His legal code was so brutally strict that almost every crime, including stealing a cabbage, carried the death penalty. Historians say Draco was once asked why he punished minor crimes with death, and his reasoning was chillingly simple. Minor crimes deserved death, and he simply had no harsher punishment left for major ones. This is where we get the word draconian. But Athens quickly realized this didn't work. Executing people for stealing vegetables didn't reduce theft. It just created a city full of terrified, resentful citizens. Within a few decades, the statesman Solon tore up almost all of Draco's laws and replaced them with something radically different. Punishment based on the severity of the actual harm done. It sounds obvious now. In the 6th century BCE, it was revolutionary. But wait, what about the punishments that weren't even about proving guilt? What if the ancient world sometimes skipped guilt entirely and let fate decide? Enter trial by ordeal. Across medieval Europe from roughly the 9th to the 13th century, if evidence was unclear, communities didn't always turn to logic, they turned to pain. An accused person might be forced to carry a red-hot iron bar for several paces, and their wound would be bandaged for 3 days. If it healed cleanly, God had spoken, innocent. If it festered, guilty. In another version, the accused was bound and thrown into water blessed by a priest. Sinking meant the water accepted you, innocent. Floating meant the water rejected you, guilty and now facing execution anyway. Read that again. Drowning proved your innocence. Surviving proved your guilt. The historian Robert Bartlett has written extensively on how these trials weren't random cruelty. They were a society's attempt to outsource an impossible decision to something they believed was beyond human bias. It didn't work the way they hoped, but it reveals something very human. When we don't trust our own judgment, we invent a higher authority to blame instead. Here's a pattern interrupt for you, because it's easy to sit here in the 21st century and feel superior, comfortable, evolved. But before you get too smug, ask yourself this: is public shaming really gone, or did it just move online? Let's talk about Rome, because Rome turned punishment into spectacle on an industrial scale. Crucifixion is the one everyone knows, a slow public death used specifically because it was slow and public. Rome wasn't just killing criminals. It was broadcasting a warning along every major road. But less famous is a punishment called poena cullei, reserved for the crime of killing one's own father. The condemned was sewn into a leather sack, sometimes with a dog, a rooster, a snake, and a monkey, and thrown into a river. Historians debate exactly how often this was carried out versus how much was legal theory meant to horrify on paper. But either way, the message was the same. Some crimes were considered so unnatural that ordinary execution wasn't symbolic enough. But here's where it gets stranger. Not every ancient society believed in violent punishment at all. Among many indigenous nations of North America, including several Iroquois Confederacy communities, justice often centered on restitution rather than retribution. If someone caused harm, the goal wasn't to inflict equal suffering, it was to restore balance. A killing might be resolved through compensation to the grieving family, gifts, labor, or formal apology, delivered through community elders, sometimes averting blood feuds that could otherwise stretch for generations. This wasn't softness, it was strategy. In small, tightly interdependent communities, executing or maiming a member could weaken the entire group's ability to survive. Punishment wasn't just about the individual, it was about protecting the whole. And that contrast, punishment as spectacle versus punishment as repair, is the real fault line running through all of ancient justice. Because think about what punishment actually reveals about a society. A city that mutilates thieves in public is telling you that fear is their currency. A council that resolves a killing through restitution is telling you that survival depends on cohesion, not domination. A king who carves his laws into stone for everyone to read is telling you that even he believes power needs a limit, even if that limit only applies to some. Ancient punishment wasn't random cruelty. It was a mirror. It showed exactly what a civilization feared losing, and exactly who it was willing to sacrifice to protect it. Now here's the twist most people miss when they study this stuff. Many of these primitive systems were actually more procedurally careful than we give them credit for. In ancient Egypt, court records from as early as the 20th dynasty, around 1100 BCE, describe formal tomb robbery trials with witness testimony, cross-examination, and even confessions extracted under questioning, bureaucratic in a way that feels startlingly modern. These weren't mobs with torches. They were officials, records, and process. The brutality existed alongside real structure, not instead of it. But what about the exceptions? The moments ancient justice systems actually tried to be merciful. Sanctuary is one of the strangest. In ancient Greece, and later formalized across medieval Christian Europe, certain temples and churches were considered untouchable ground. If you reached the altar before your pursuers caught you, you were for a time safe, even from execution. Authorities couldn't drag you out by force without committing a sacrilege considered worse than your original crime. It sounds like a plot device from a movie. It was real law, practiced for centuries, and it forced even the harshest societies to admit that some spaces mattered more than punishment itself. So somewhere between Hammurabi's stone slab and a medieval church door, an idea was quietly forming. One we still argue about today. That punishment needs limits. That justice isn't the same as revenge. That a society is not just judged by how it treats its worst members in private, but by how publicly and how permanently it's willing to destroy them. A civilization carves its fears into stone. A civilization drowns its uncertainty in a river and calls it judgment. A civilization sows its outcasts into sacks and calls it order. A civilization forgives at an altar and calls it mercy. Every single punishment humans have ever invented is really just a society trying to answer one impossible question. What do we do with the parts of ourselves we can't control? We like to imagine progress as a straight line. Barbaric past, enlightened present. But look closer and the line bends. Some ancient courts had more procedural rigor than we assume. Some modern punishments are crueler than we admit. The tools changed. The impulse, fear, order, control, mercy never really did. So picture that square again. The bread thief, the crowd, the blade about to fall. Except now you know what you didn't before. You know that punishment was never really just about the crime. It was about what the people watching needed to believe about themselves. That they were safe, that they were righteous, that the world made sense. The thief's hand was never really the point. The crowd was justice has always been less about what criminals deserve, and more about what societies need to believe.